Thank you, Katie, and Katie, who is also leads this network, is here. We alternate with our introductions, and we're also very pleased to have Tanya Evans here, who's our one of our steering group committee, and she will be chairing the session. So she'll do the bios and introduce speakers shortly. Introduce the network to anyone who has only just joined us this week. This is a series of online, forgive me, I'm also admitting people whilst I do this, and apparently I do not have the capacity to do two things at once. So it's a research network called Inheriting the Family, Emotions, Heritage and History, something along those lines. And we are very keen on getting people to think about objects that they've inherited, stories that they've inherited, and explore how those construct our identities, what they mean to us, and identities from the personal through to the national. Do visit our website. Do join us on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, where we have a presence, and do talk to us there and share your objects and stories. We always welcome those. And this is kind of the third event of the network. We had a lot of people interested, and thanks to the joys of being online at the moment and the capacity to do that, we decided to break this up into a series of workshops. And so today we have the workshop, which is based around family cookbooks and recipes, emotions and identities. So we will have all of the speakers give their 10-minute presentations, and then we'll open up to questions at the end of that. As you know, Katie has started the recording. If you would prefer not to be visible, please do just switch your camera off, because we will hope eventually to share the recording via the website. I think that's everything. So I will hand across to Tanya, who I should say has got a new book coming out about family history, which is it's absolutely fantastic. So do keep a lookout for that. You will thoroughly enjoy it. But I will hand over to Tanya to do the introductions.
Thanks, Joanne. It's wonderful to be here and wonderful to be part of this network and working with brilliant people like Joanne, Katie and Ashley Bunwell. I am Tanya Evans, as Joanne said, and I'm based at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, and I've worked for a few years now on family history, and I am deeply invested in cooking and cookbooks, which are kind of handily behind me here, and I've been talking about the wonderful ways in which lots of family historians that I've communicated with over the years have worked with cookbooks and recipes. So I'm really looking forward to our set of speakers tonight. First up, we have Catherine Kate Wenth, who is a genealogist and family historian, who graduated from the University of Strathclyde in 2019 with an MSc in genealogical, paleographic and heraldic studies, which sounds like an amazing degree. And she's currently a first-year PhD student at the University of Leeds. And her thesis is entitled Ancestral Attributes, Intergenerational Influence and Family Development in Britain from about 1750 to 1950. Thank you so much, Kate. I look forward to hearing you talk about cooking with kindness.
That's lovely. Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that. Okay, lovely. Thank you very much for the introduction and the opportunity to talk today. So I'll just move the screen on. Okay. So my talk centres on 2 family recipe books, and I'd like to briefly introduce the people who created them and then speak a little bit about the books themselves. Then I'll move on to describe the personal memories and feelings that these books and other associated objects evoke. And I'll just finish off with some quandaries and deliberations that have arisen whilst I've been reflecting on the future of these objects. So here's a photo of the 2 creators of these books together. On the left is my maternal grandma, Nora, and on the right is her sister, my great Auntie Nancy. So these two books are quite contrasting, and for me, they visually represent the two personalities. The red book at the top left of the slide was my grandma's, and for me, it signifies her hectic life. She was always busy doing something to do with the home, the family, friends, the church, neighbours, or the village. And keeping the recipes neat and tidy wasn't a priority, as the picture top right demonstrates. This image shows the recipes written on the back of old Christmas cards, envelopes, any old scrap of paper that was to hand. And they're all just slotted loose leaf into the cover of the book. It brings back memories of Grandma's sociability and connectedness with others. And she was always on the lookout for new recipes. Food and cooking was Grandma's thing. When she was about 14, she left school and became a kitchen maid for the Parker family at what she always referred to as the big house, which was Market Stainton Hall in Lincolnshire. She was there for about 7 years, but before she left to help her mother look after her sick father, at the time of leaving, she progressed to the position of household cook. Auntie's book, on the other hand, the black hardbound book, demonstrates a more disciplined approach to life. And I believe that this was most likely influenced by her time in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force during World War II. Interestingly, both books contain mostly cake, pastry, or dessert recipes. There are very few savoury dishes in either. As the majority were written after World War II, I'm assuming this is because of the increased availability of sugar and certain fruits such as bananas and pineapples after the war. In many cases, Grandma in her book noted the name of the person that gave her the recipe. And her book also contains other household recipes, such as homemade medicines and cleaning recipes for blankets and furniture. Auntie's book, on the other hand, is very ordered and is purely cooking and baking recipes. So moving on to memories, senses, and emotions. For me, the two books remind me of Saturdays. Auntie and Grandma lived just a few hundred yards away from each other, and so on a Saturday we would visit both. Calling on Auntie frequently involved a slice of fruit pie, or my particular favourite, Wellington squares, or what are probably better known now as Millionaire's shortbread. Although we've tried to recreate these, we've never been able to replicate them exactly, even using Auntie's recipe. And I guess that that's because the key ingredient is missing, and that's the affection with which Auntie baked them for us. Auntie made these treats with love and kindness, and that is irreplaceable. The sight of Grandma's book reminds me of watching her make flaky pastry. As I look at the book, I start to recall images of her cooking Saturday lunch. I can visualize her hands working the pastry, then rolling it out and placing it into the blue and white enamel pie dish before adding the beef filling. As the pie cooks in the oven, I see Grandma at the kitchen sink preparing the vegetables she's picked from the garden just moments before. I remember our chatter and our conversations. I can hear her voice. The video playing out in my mind at this point moves to the dining table. Grandma brings the food through and places it down on the table in front of us. The centerpiece is the beef steak pie with golden flaky pastry. Grandma cuts into the pie and I can hear the familiar crunch of the pastry, and I see the steam billowing out as the first slice is served. I sense the smell as it wafts across the table, and I recall the taste. Cooking, baking, and food personified Grandma. It was her gift, her skill. It was how she earned her living, how she kept her family going, how she socialized, and essentially how she showed love and affection. I gave this talk the title Cooking Up Kindness because that's exactly what both of these ladies did. Through food, they conveyed the unspoken word and gave something of themselves in the cooking or the baking. I naturally miss their presence, but the strong, vibrant memories I have of both of them means that I still feel connected. Memories that are evoked by looking through these two recipe books and associated objects, such as the stew pot and the pie funnel in the slide, illuminate moments in time which cannot now be repeated. The sights, sounds, smells and tastes can never be fully recreated, making the memories an important replacement. So the stew pot that you see in the slide there is not just an old, cracked, disused piece of crockery that was heading for the bin until I rescued it. For me, it holds an image of my grandma and a video of that time. And that's the reason I couldn't see it being thrown away. To have let it go would have felt to me like I was throwing all those memories away. These recipe books, the stew pot and the pie funnel, are emotion triggers. I would go so far as to say that these objects instigate time travel, taking me back to that moment in time where my life was at that point, what I was feeling, what I was experiencing. I sense it all over again. These objects are a reminder of the bond we shared. And effectively, they're time capsules, holding that moment in suspense. Now, these objects form a part of my support system. If I've had a bad day or I'm feeling down, I can go to these objects and the memories and feelings they evoke comfort me. Although these two ladies are no longer here, their love and the support they gave and the impact and influence they have on my life is very much still alive. And the recipe books and the objects allow me to reconnect with all of that every time I look at them. As I was working on this paper, I came across some quotes I thought I'd share. David Sutton describes such recipe books as nostalgia cookbooks. And Leila Pazagadi describes food as having the unique multi-sensory ability to recover a deeply buried memory and has the ability to locate and relocate oneself throughout space and time. And I think these are quite expressive of the importance and value of inherited recipe books and the other objects and the significance of the memories they hold. Over the course of the last few weeks, I've been led to reflect on objects, their past and future. With no children to leave items to, alternative scenarios need to be thought about, and last week's discussion prompted me to ask a number of questions. So can the emotional value of an object for one person have value to subsequent family members? If so, how far generationally does this value last? Is it better to leave meaningful items to a person you care about, whether they're a relative or not? So for example, maybe godchildren or friends' children, or to stipulate that items be sold or disposed of? Should the future of objects be discussed with potential recipients, or would that add undue pressure? Or should the choice of preserving an object be the prerogative of the giver or the receiver? And needless to say, I don't have answers to any of those questions, but I'd be really interested to hear anybody else's thoughts on that. So thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Kate. Beautifully structured paper. Magnificent. Next up, we have Dr. Alison Baxter. I had the pleasure of meeting Alison back in 2019 for the first event of this network, which is the last time I got on a plane, last time I went overseas. So I'm getting nostalgic about that moment. Alison was awarded her PhD in creative writing from Oxford Brookes in 2019 for a thesis entitled Debatable Lands, Exploring the Boundaries of Fiction and Non-Fiction Through Family History. Her book, which I recommend wholeheartedly, is entitled A Cornish Cargo, and it's based on the lives of one branch of her family, and this was published in 2020. And she's now working on a novel about Victorian women, but today she's going to be talking about her Scottish ancestors, who will also get their own book eventually. And her paper is entitled Recipes That Hide a Broken Heart. Thank you, Alison.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Good morning, good evening, whatever time it is for everybody. It's great to be here. Now, just before I share my screen, I'm going to kind of wave my hand in the air. I don't know whether you can see the ring that I'm wearing, little sapphires and diamonds. Take note of it because it's going to come up later. Right, now I am going to share my screen. There we go. Excellent. Now, I have called this paper Recipes That Hide a Broken Heart, and later on you'll see why. But I wanted to start by talking briefly about what recipes mean to us. And I think probably Kate has already made most of the points I want to make and made them better, but here we go. Recipes anchor us to our culture, our home, our family. We inherit them, we pass them on. I'm thinking, for example, of the Syrian sisters here in Oxford who've set up a business cooking Syrian food. They are in exile, but they remain connected to their homeland through their food. We inherit our favourite recipes in different ways. Sometimes they may not even be written down. My friend Henry learned to make meatballs from watching his Greek mother, and I've learned to make them through watching him. Never seen anything written down, but I'm quite confident in making them. Or we may have inherited a notebook or a scrapbook, the kind of lovely things that Kate was showing us, where we may even add some of our own recipes that we've cut out from magazines and we save them. Or we may have a favourite cookery book, and this is mine. The Times cookery book. I bought it in the 1970s when I left home for the first time. It was the book that my mother cooked from. Whether it was for everyday meals or special occasions, you could always rely on Katie Stewart. And everything in this book reminds me of my mother. It falls open at the recipes that I use most often, especially this page, scones. I am proud to say I am known for my scones. My daughter's Jamaican in-laws have taken to them in a big way. So for family parties, we'll have maybe jerk chicken, goat curry, always followed by scones with jam and cream. My granddaughter will inherit both those traditions and make them her own. But although this book is my mother's legacy to me, I have to say that my relationship with her was quite problematic, and hers with her own mother even more so. So I have no memories of cosy baking sessions in my grandmother's kitchen or special recipes handed down from mother to daughter. On the other hand, I was close to my father's mother, my Scottish gran, Jean. And here she is. She's the little girl in the white pinafore with her brothers, Frank and Jimmy, and her sister Amy, and Toby, the fox terrier. I hope you can see him perched on the last Shetland pony on the right. Just to explain the image, their father, my great-grandfather, kept a hotel and livery stables in a small village outside Aberdeen. He supplied horses to anyone who needed them, to the local farmers, to pull the bus, to pull the milk cart, anybody who needed a horse. I know this because what I inherited from my Scottish Gran Jean was not recipes, but a collection of stories, a fascination with the past, and a desire to write. And today, I want to talk not about her, but about something we touched on last week, which again ties in with Kate's presentation. It's the problematic inheritance of people who have no direct descendants. Who do they leave things to? And how are they remembered? Jimmy, on the right, had children. And it was one of his grandsons that actually sent me this photo. We like to share our discoveries. My cousin Steve had the picture, and I was able to tell him the name of the dog and a story about one of the Shetland ponies getting into the house and making a clean sweep of the tea table. But Frank, on the left, emigrated to Australia. And although he married, he had no children. I remember a stamp album with Australian stamps, but apart from that and a couple of photos, there is nothing and no one left to remind us that Frank ever lived. He is a faint shadow in the family tree. As is Amy, my Gran's older sister. An unusual name for a Scottish girl. In those days, it was much more common in England. Amy's mother, my great-grandmother, had been maid to the Marchioness of Huntly, and so she wrote to ask permission to give her baby daughter her former mistress's name. I have the letter from the Marchioness graciously giving her consent. So, unlike Frank, I do have a few items to remember Amy by, not just the letter from the Marchioness, but the ring that I showed you at the beginning, that was hers. And so was this cookery book. On the left, it says, Amy Smythe, Balcarras, Echt. And on the right, Household Cookery, 12th of October, 1895. She would have been 16 when she started it, and I expect she was helping her mother in the hotel kitchen. Amy also had a recipe for scones, and it's not that different from mine, it's just lacking the egg, which I firmly believe makes all the difference. I'm interested that she called them English scones. I don't know whether anybody can help me with this. I wonder whether it's to distinguish them from what I know as drop scones or Scotch pancakes. But anyway, Amy and I are connected by this recipe for scones. According to my gran, her big sister was something of a tomboy as a child and loved animals. There's a wonderful story that involves the camels belonging to Lord George Sanger's circus. But Amy grew up to follow a very conventional woman's path in life. This certificate in dressmaking was awarded the year after she began her recipe book. I wonder if she ever tried to rebel against domesticity, but there's no evidence either way. Amy never married, but her life was apparently not empty of romance. It was some years before I read all the way through her cookery book and found, hiding in plain sight, after a recipe for Victoria sandwich, 2 poems. That discovery made me think about how a book of recipes may be the most private place a woman has for her writing if she doesn't keep a diary or a journal. So the first poem on the left is entitled Love's Melody. It's a nostalgic love poem. The second verse begins, "Ah, those days we roamed together, happy as could be. Skies all fair with sunny weather, hearts all glad and free." But the second poem is called Regret and is clearly marking the end of the idyll. The last verse on this page reads, "Proud foxglove, dost thou nod thy head? Thou too in dust all prone shall lie. Like thee our love was proud and high, and now our love is with the dead." The poems are followed by the initials WMW and a date, 27th of May, 1899. Amy would have been 20. I don't know if she copied the poems from somewhere. A quick Google search gives me nothing, and to be honest, they don't strike me as particularly good poetry. Perhaps she wrote them herself. My gran was a published poet, and their father wrote verse, so it's not impossible that Amy did too. So that's the first mystery. But the big mystery is, who was WMW? Did he give Amy the sapphire ring? And did he die, or did something else happen to bring their romance to an end? It's the one story my gran didn't leave. I've tried to find out and failed dismally. My gran, I know, once had a boyfriend called Andrew Williamson, so I've searched for other Williamsons of the right age and drawn a blank. I don't know where to take it from there, but Amy was obviously heartbroken. Though I'm pleased to say that sometime later, and I think it must be later if you look at how the handwriting has changed, she went back to collecting recipes. And on the following page, is a recipe for Crystal Palace pudding. Amy was only 32 when she died of a spinal hemorrhage, which I believe means a bleed to the brain. It was Christmas Eve 1911, and she had been ill for just 6 hours. Frank was in Australia by then, and Jimmy in Canada, in Alberta. My gran had recently become engaged to my grandfather, but they didn't marry till 1913. So I wonder if my gran felt she couldn't leave her parents. I never knew my great aunt Amy, but I treasure her cookery book as much as anything for my gran's sake. But I can't be sure in the next generation that my daughter will feel the same. So this has been just a fleeting commemoration of a forgotten life. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. That's glorious. Poor old Amy.
I know,
Very
it is
sad.
absolutely tragic. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And I'm sure others are starting to team with questions, and feel free to use the chat to pop them in there, and we can start lining them up, because I'm sure there will be many to come. Thank you, Alison. Now we move on to Val Hewson, who is the chair and editor of Reading Sheffield, a community history group researching and recording reading and libraries in Sheffield. She's also an honorary visiting fellow at Sheffield Hallam University, and she'll be speaking to us about recipe books and easily overlooked heritage. Thank you so much, Val.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Here we are. So thank you, everyone, and hello. Around 1953, I can just move my slide. There. Around 1953, the Good Housekeeping Institute published a set of booklets, generously illustrated on thin paper without covers. The books cost 1 6 each. I calculate about £2 or $1 today, and each one covers a specific skill: cakes, pastry, preserving, and so on. The booklets here belong to Jane, who remembers her mum using them in the 1950s and 60s. And when her mum died, relatively young, Jane kept the books. She still, she says, consults the one on home preserves. It has fallen apart. It's the third one from the left there. And there is barely one page of it intact, and I hate picking it up because it falls apart in my hands. Jane could write out the recipes, or she could secure a better copy of all of these books. They are available on eBay and other places. But she's never done this. For her, the booklets not only help her to make good food, but they also, in a way that was surely unimagined by Good Housekeeping, preserve her relationship with the mother that she lost. The booklets were included in a recent exhibition curated by the Reading Sheffield book. This paper is an account of what we learned. The idea was to illustrate the everyday personal heritage, a heritage which is easily overlooked, but which, when we examine it, makes us think about what we each carry from the past into the future and why. The exhibition also painted a picture of the society which generated the books. In other words, a shared heritage as well as an individual one. The books, which you can see here in their display cabinets in the Central Library in Sheffield, and we had about 70 of them, were collected simply by asking around in Sheffield. A few of them came from charity shops locally or from eBay. Most of the people we spoke to turned out to have books tucked away. Enthusiasts turned out to have whole bookcases. And even those who, like me, claimed to be uninterested in cooking, often had something. And this prompts the question, why do we keep books we appear to have so little use for? Is it because they can conjure memory? The variety of the books that we collected surprised us. We had no particular expectations, and we deliberately went out to find random, not representative books. So the ones you see here represent a manufacturer of margarine, a baking powder and flour manufacturer, and on the left, Top Hat Cookery, which is a 1920s pressure cooker or slow cooker that I have never come across before, but looks amazing. Most of the books are dated between about 1890 and 1970, with the 1930s and 1950s particularly well covered. We have instruction manuals for stoves and kitchen equipment like icing kits, booklets promoting flour, margarine, baking powder, etc. You see baking powder in the middle there, and also on the left, the Atora beef suet, which I think is still available. Books from newspapers, like the one on the right from the Star, to encourage reader loyalty, and also domestic encyclopedias of the sort that used to be presented to brides to show them what to do. And then there are books by yesterday's Delias and Nigellas, almost all now forgotten. And the exception, I think, is Mrs. Beeton. We got more Mrs. Beeton books than anything else, and here are 3 of them. Mrs. Beeton, a facsimile edition from the 1980s on the left. On the right, an edition from about 1900, which looks very worn. And in the middle, an edition, a paperback edition costing only 6pence, and presumably aimed at people with very little money, and that's a paperback edition from the 1920s. Most of the books are worn, a few almost to destruction, and this may be not so much the effect of time, I think, as of use. There are mysterious stains and still gritty or sticky pages. Occasionally, scraps of paper are tucked inside, marking a page and then forgotten. Here, in a 1930s book we found on eBay, we found a telegram sent to a house in Jersey just after the Channel Islands were liberated in 1945, and presumably snatched up to mark a page and then forgotten. The telegram, by the way, is dull. It's only about a business meeting. And then in the same book was this carefully cut out drawing of a rather glamorous woman in silk stockings and a slip making a telephone call. Why? Why was this cut out? Was it from an advert for silk stockings? Was it from a story? We just don't know. We will never know. In the margins of the books are handwritten reminders, explanations, comments. On the left, you can see from a domestic science teacher's cookery book that she used in school, the words, "Nonsense, do not use," about batters. Sometimes we find that children have crayoned over the pages of the books. And then there are names and addresses, like the wife of the soldier living in wartime married quarters in Bulawayo, in what is now Zimbabwe, but was then Rhodesia. The book now belongs to their daughter. And then sometimes there are inscriptions on the right from the unknown LHS, who wrote in a copy of Mrs. Beeton, "To my wife, on this final sign of our getting a home, 1/10/27 LHS." And we have no idea who LHS is, because this is another book that we bought in a charity shop. Most interesting perhaps for today, and probably the most treasured books of all, are often messy homemade books. Here, for an example, is Angela's book on the left, which is stuffed as full as can be with recipes collected over 30 years. They're on scraps of paper, they're cut out from magazines and food packets. Some of them are typed, and they are in a variety of handwriting. And then on the right, the little exercise book, very battered, in which Ellen's mother made notes for the cookery course she did in Newcastle in 1923. That's the first page with a recipe for orange cake and also small sponge cakes. And then Pam's domestic science book on the left from her school in 1963 in Sheffield, showing the titles of the recipes that she was working on. And then on the right, her mum's notes from an evening class in cookery at a Sheffield school in 1957. "Good with a bottle of red wine," reads one of her comments on an Italian recipe. This is the personal, What about the shared or the societal? The books all, without exception, are addressed to women. Homemaking is to be their vocation, and men are merely bit players on this stage. For example, in illustrations, happily consuming delicious food. And I tell you, there are not many of those. Men just don't feature at all. This is apparent too. The books range in terms of style, ingredients, and price, from the humble, like the sixpenny Mrs. Beeton I showed you earlier, through the aspirational to the frankly superior. The recipes themselves are revealing too. Lard, animal fat for cooking if you don't know it, is a staple in these recipes, and oil is rarely mentioned. Sugar and salt are liberally used. Fruit and vegetables are both traditional and seasonal. Fruitcakes abound, and lemon drizzle cake is unknown. There are doubtful recipes for curry and spaghetti, but on the whole, international cuisines are ignored. And we found only one vegetarian book, dating from the 1930s, looking very stern and using the unattractive term non-flesh cookery. It's apparent too that homemaking is an onerous business. Dishes are prepared from scratch, with meat being cut up and trimmed. Many of the books include detailed diagrams for jointing meat, which make me, a vegetarian, go quite pale. Vegetables come still covered in soil. Puddings are steamed for hours, and cakes, as you can see here in this picture, are elaborately decorated. Hand a few books around a group, and tastes, smells, textures are recalled, and then incidents and people. 3 neighbours of mine, all aged over 70, one now 90, bonded over this Biro book from 1957. Biro is a brand of flour well known in the north of England, and the company long produced its own recipe books. Making pastry, one neighbour said. I always made the easy chocolate cake for my children. The thing about Biro was it taught you basic methods, and then you could practice and try more complicated things. I was drawn in myself, I confess, as this Biro book is the only recipe book my mother ever had, at least that I remember, and I well remember its excellent Christmas cake recipe, which I show you there, although as a family we didn't like icing, so we never iced it. These recipe books are ordinary, humble, and probably not expected by their manufacturers and publishers to have a long life. Yet here so many of them still are, some in use, others gathering dust but surviving. They are an easily overlooked heritage, but one which evokes our homes through many of our senses, and one which transmits knowledge, and so I think one which appears to be tremendously powerful. To finish on an uncertain note, I wonder about these books today. I wonder when they will, how they will survive, when Google, not books, seems to be the source of recipes for so many people. Thank you.
Oh, Val, how wonderful. I could spend hours working my way through those. How amazing. Thank you so much for that.
Pleasure.
That was good. Next up, we have Lucinda Matthews-Jones, who is a senior lecturer at Liverpool John Moores University, where she teaches modules on gender and urban histories, and she researches the British settlement movement through the lens of home studies. Her paper is entitled Telling Stories Through My Granny's Cookery Books. Thank you.
And thanks so much. There's a kind of some nice synergies running through these papers, and I'm going to pick up on some of them in this paper as well. Patricia Matthews-Jones would have been surprised to have been the subject of this presentation. The life she recounted largely centred on her much-loved father, William, and her husband, Bobby. In 2003, when I was an undergraduate, I tried to interview her for a third-year assessment, and I was left frustrated by her inability to express herself outside the confines of the men in her life, even if I was related to them. In hindsight, I should have been more thoughtful about how I got my tweed-skirted, cardigan-wearing granny to open up about her life. I should have chatted to her in her kitchen as she cooked. I should have turned to her cookery books, but by then they had been placed underneath the stairs or stuffed in kitchen drawers. It was only a chance discussion of my own enjoyment of cookery books almost 15 years later that led her to show me her eclectic collection of cookery books and for me to reclaim them as my own, much to her amusement. When she died in 2018, they became for me treasured mementos. When we entered our first lockdown, I returned to them again for the comfort and homeliness they seemed to offer me. The cookery books are not only emotional reminders of my granny, however, but they also tell stories of who she was. My grandmother was a homemaker, and taken together, her cookery books speak of how her homemaking centered on her dining room table and feeding her family. Her family initially meant her parents, William and Dorothea Baker, and her brother, Donald. My granny was born in the Norfolk seaside town of Cromer in 1921. A childhood accident left her bedbound for a year and unable to walk unaided for the rest of her life. In the house her father built and semi-designed, my grandmother became the family cook. My great-grandmother Dorothea, who had been a nurse in the First World War, had decided that she was no good at cooking and housewifery more generally, and went back to night nursing when my granny was old enough to take charge of the house. In doing so, my teenage granny became the daughter housewife. My granny never spoke of having any formal education, but there are hints of governesses. Her life and heart instead was bound to her family home, and the cookery books in this collection tell a story of training and proficiency in cookery. And it's noteworthy that the largest number of published books come from the 1930s and 1940s. There are 3 books in this period that stand out for me. Firstly, my granny produced her own cookery book. She collected recipes in a little Holloway private recipe cookbook, and the recipes came from a shop in Scarborough, connecting her to her family, her mother's family in Scarborough. The embossed stamp, however, at the front also places the recipe book in her parents' house. The recipe book falls onto the recipe for beef chops under the section Meat, Games and Poultry. However, in a similar vein, it is actually the cake and pastries and jellies, creams and ices that brims with the most recipes. My granny actually had an incredibly sweet tooth, and it's one of the things that we really remember about her. Secondly, I also is this main cookery book, published in March 1937. The book's inscription shows the network of female family members sharing cookery. As the inscription shows, it was given to her by her own granny, Agnes Wilson, on the 22nd of August, 1937, when my gran would have been 16 years old. Covered in what looks like greaseproof paper, the spine is broken, and it's one of the most highly used books in the collection. Pages are starting to fall out. And I think it's probably very clear that this was an object that my gran really prized, but you can also see that there's an RSPC bookmark sticking out, so showing that it's also an object that moved with her throughout her life. The third book that stands out for me is this wartime cookery book, costing 1 shilling. It comes from the Daily Express, and it was written in 1939. It saw itself as a common sense cookery book for the war. But when I first saw this cookery book, I thought it might be a heritage style cookery book that joined many others in her collection. My gran was a big fan of local customs and food practices, and she bought but never seems to have used cookery books about local food around Britain. But returning to the wartime cookery book, what really strikes me is that actually she would have used this book during the Second World War. And I should have known that it was unlikely that my granny would have had a wartime cookery book, because neither my granny or Grandad Jones ever discussed the war. So it's a kind of unspoken event in their lives, but this becomes a sort of object that frames the war for our family. Even if they chose not to talk about the war, it seems that my granny did carry over some of the dishes. The page that this book naturally falls on is for a milk jelly, a dish that she often made for my dad and my siblings. And to me, it seems incredible to think that perhaps a 1939 wartime recipe is donning her table in the 1990s. After the war, she married my grandfather after she left her seaside town of Cromer, and she became a beautician in Selfridges. My grandparents met at a residential hotel, and like many other women of her generation, my granny was effectively trained for marriage. She became a full-time housewife after they were married, and her collection appears to have grown with a 1949 radiation cookery book. Does this hint at the idea that her oven was the gas company oven and radiation? But it's actually this cookery book that seems to be the most used from this period. And I hate the title of this cookery book because it kind of doesn't flow very nicely, but it's the Good Housekeeper's Picture Cookery. Published in 1950, the year that my gran got married, and it effectively shows the story of my granny becoming a modern and post-war housewife. The cookery book prided itself on the use of pictures as learning aids, and the pictures together with step-in-step instructions gave people confidence and knowledge on how to cook. It showed you, and I quote, what the finished product should really look like. When this cookery book is compared with others in the collection, the recipes are more complicated and luxurious. In comparison to the other recipes, they're very stark and quite blank, whereas these do kind of show actually some of the things that Val raised about post-war affluence and availability of material. But they also convey something about her personality. Later cookbooks do not appear to have been used by my granny. Within her cookery book collection are extensive recipe collections, instead from magazines, food companies, and government agencies. Apart from a few unused Delia cookery pamphlets from the 1970s, there are no celebrity chef cookbooks, and there's no Mrs. Beeton in her collection. Instead, Woman and Home and Woman's Own lead her collection as she cuts and removes their recipes. She has an odd assortment of pullouts. Their survival shows how my granny was a hunter and hoarder, a point reinforced by the recipe books still being encased, a number of recipes books still being encased in envelopes where she had actually collected and ordered cookery books to be used, but were effectively just stuffed back into their envelopes. Instead, her homemade published cookery books from the 1930s and 1950s retain a dominance. It's not just the faded front covers or the broken spines that tell this story. For my granny's cookery books appear to have been living objects, where she placed the recipes that she hunted from magazines and food products. For instance, in the cover of the 1950 Good Housekeeper's Picture Cookery book, there is a recipe for hot cross buns, Del Monte peach slices, a leaflet on Danish ham, fish pie topped with bubble and squeak, and a old double newspaper of cakes and sweets. There are several handwritten recipes in this collection, written in different hand styles, and they show that my granny was part of a network that shared what they had eaten with one another. But there are moments when I stop and linger longer. It is when I stumble on her distinctive handwriting that a new aura emerges. The cookery books become a treasure chest, protecting those fragments that can so easily be lost and discarded. This attachment to my granny's handwriting might explain why my favorite cookery book is homemade. I think it's really interesting. I think this is the same exercise book that Kate actually showed on her slide. My gran never wasted anything. She repurposed an old exercise book she had used when she was 15 years old by tearing out some of the front pages. She would, in this book, use the printed copies and handwritten recipes for her own. And she writes and stuffs it with recipes and scraps of paper. It is my granny's use of her cookery book as a repository space that makes me more attached to this cookery book. Towards the end of her life, it was her handwritten cookery books that I remember the most. And I remember her taking them out of the drawers, placing them onto the drawer and the unit in such a way that they were always perched, but she would always run her finger down, she would slam it shut very quickly and then slam it shut. She knew her recipes, but she always used them to later check. But I do have some concluding thoughts. Even though this cookery book collection speaks of who my granny was, they are objects of discomfort and absence. No matter how hard I look in them, I do not know what dishes she cooked for us. And I can't remember those dishes enough to be able to kind of recreate them in the archive she's left. In doing so, they reveal the ways in which I feel I may have failed in my duty as a granddaughter to know our family's food, even if it was she who invented these food moments and legacies. And in some ways, it also reveals something of the problem of being a historian granddaughter, when in actual fact, you kind of know the aura of the archive. Because in some ways, these books perhaps only are able to speak to me because I know the person who owned them. When I was 18, at the same time, I remember asking for a recipe of a fish dish my granny would make with sweet corn and savoury scones in a white sauce. She wrote it down for me in blue pen on lined paper. I don't remember when I lost or misplaced this slip of paper, but I do feel a quiet shame for doing so. This instance not only reminds me of the fragility of paper fragments inherited, but also the limits of cookery books when the cook is no longer there to navigate their pages. Even if I can't cook the dishes that were laid on the dining room table, my granny's cookbooks are a physical anchor of the food stories and rituals my paternal family regularly share. I know how my grandmother used them, but also at the same time, they also evoke a feeling of homeliness and comfort that for my siblings when my parents divorced, enabled us to kind of feel a sense of homeliness that perhaps was neglected at certain points in our lives. The collection of cookery books, though, are essentially tidy and clean. There are no splashes or messes. Her commitment to nourishing her family is evident in ways in which she makes these cookery books brim and vibrate with food stories. It does not matter, however, that I don't think she used many of the recipes that are in these cookbooks. What matters was that she wrapped herself up in expressing her love through breakfast, 11s, lunch, dinner, and bedtime snacks that would quickly be devoured by us. The serving and feeding of my family is an attribute she has passed down to me. Like her, I turn to my cookery books to do this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy. That was wonderful, marvelous. Like all of the rest of the papers, I shall wait for the screens to align so we can all see our faces once more. Thank you to all our speakers. Really magnificent papers. I suppose, as you all gather your thoughts, I'm so struck by how gendered female this world is. Did anyone come across any men engaged in this practice?
I must admit, when I think Val was talking, it did suddenly strike me that actually I think there are presences of my granddad in the archive, but he would never have cooked. He just did not cook. He wasn't a cook. But one of the things that I think, for instance, when he had his heart attack, he got an Adam Brooks hospital recipe cookbook, which I think speaks more to a kind of male experience of food. And also, I think there were hints that my grandmother was trying to engage in cooking Indian food, because my granddad had been in the Indian Army, but she was very, very plain fared as a cook. And so that cookery book exists, but it is not being used at all.
Thanks
but that's the only presence of men that I think I could actually make in the whole collection.
As I said, I found very few references to men in some of the domestic management books, which were about running a household, not just cooking. There are references to men, so things like remembering to brush your husband's jacket as he goes off to work in the morning so that he looks smart, and changing your apron when he comes home, so that and smiling at him, because remember, he has had a hard day out working. And men are useful for things like changing plugs on electrical items and that sort of thing, but there is no evidence of them being involved in cooking other than eating the end products that I've found.
Thanks, Val. Helen, Caller, did you have a point? You put your finger up in that.
It was, yes, slightly aside, but I remember having quite a few children's cookery books, and with lots of pictures and bring to the boil and call mother type of thing. But they all did have little girls and little boys both doing it, and so that was 1960s anyway. So it's quite interesting in terms of the gender side of that.
Thanks, Helen. Any of our other speakers have anything to say about the gendering of these environments? or emotions for that matter? No? Well, sorry, Joanne.
Yes, I was just going to say in terms of emotions, of course, what also really was the sort of theme through the talks is, of course, that then they evoke memories of women. So it's not just that, you know, they are artifacts which were perhaps published for women to use, but they did their job, didn't they? So you know, in a sense, that's what they generate, those emotions and feelings and memories about women. Although I think, I guess from Lucy's paper that there was a sense in which, you know, in other respects, she had to fight to try and get to the, you know, away from the men in her family, and that this is actually, so I'm not saying this is a negative thing, you know, and perhaps also it relates to the fact that these are artifacts which perhaps don't have a presence in our society. We you know, we have to sort of, you know, gather them together and remind everybody how important they are, but because they are gendered female, they can get lost a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. Alison, did you want to say something? Got your hand up.
First of all, I'm sorry that I wasn't around. Yeah, can you hear me now? Is it working?
Yep.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Sorry about this. I'm on my phone now. I'm in France. It's all a bit haywire. I was at the French network. They were brilliant, and I'm hoping I can catch up on the other two, which was Alison and well, it was the end of Kate's, and I totally missed the one on Sheffield, so I'm sorry. But I was going to say it's sort of coming in a little bit on what you're saying about men and emotion here. It's a question to all of them, really. How would you think that boys as a whole would have the same reaction as we all seem to be having to these recipe books? I'm thinking of myself because I've no interest in the collection of cookery books that I've got of mine, my grandmother's and my mother's. I just wonder whether it is a very gendered thing, that it's still in us, that sort of passing down of household stuff is a gendered thing. Just a question to everybody, really. So.
And I think I can answer that question. I don't think my brothers would have any interest in my, because actually I think it's about family rituals. And when I actually was listening to the other papers, one of the things I think that was quite interesting is it made me realize that actually, in terms of the gendered spaces of the home, my sister and I inhabited the kitchen with my granny, and the men were always outside of those rooms, and they would just come in to be a bit like, when's dinner? And I wonder if in some ways it's kind of our sort of a relationship with those rituals and those memories that they evoke that means that these objects actually have more significance to us. Because my family have these family food narratives about my grandmother, but for my dad, he always talks about the idea that my gran would watch Blue Peter, and what was ever shown on Blue Peter on Monday was on his table on Tuesday. And that's how he talks about the food culture. But I actually intrinsically remember watching my granny cook, but I don't think that was a male experience.
Any of the other speakers want to respond to Alison's question?
I found that when I was collecting these books around Sheffield, although I asked men I knew and men who are interested in cooking and good cooks, much better than I am, that they did not have books to offer. They had memories of their mother's cooking, but they didn't seem to have inherited or kept any books or have much interest in them. All of the books in our exhibition, there were about 70, came from women.
I was just going to comment about my own father. I mean, for somebody who was born in 1918, he was relatively enlightened in the sense that he at least made his own breakfast. He could cook eggs, he could cook kippers, he could cook sardines on toast. But if you talk to him about food, his memories were associated with school, with boarding school. You know, he had stories to tell about the dishes that they referred to as frog spawn and train smash. I believe train smash included something to do with jam. But he wouldn't talk about home cooking. Now, I don't know whether that was, you know, because he was sent off to boarding school when he was very small. But his nostalgia, in a kind of complicated way, was for school food.
Mary, did you have a point to add there?
I just wondered to what extent the experience of the Second World War changed some men's attitudes towards food and cooking, because they were often much more involved in creating food, creating meals. And my father describes going to an American air base and watching the American airmen make donuts, and then the kind of miracle of seeing these donuts automatically turn over halfway through. And even though his mother was a good cook, it was that sort of American experience that he described. And when he cooked for us, which was very, very rare, he cooked corned beef and went back to sort of wartime food.
Thanks, Mary. I guess what strikes me, I was kind of reading over Isabel's point about Oxford Brookes having the archives, the personal libraries of Carluccio, Ken Hom and others. And I read a lot of cookery books, right? What strikes me in the ways that Gordon Ramsay, Jamie Oliver, Ken Hom kind of construct their identity, professional identities, is they're constantly invoking the personal, their home, their families in that process. I mean, look at Gordon, Tana's front and center, those kids are front and center. And I think that's an interesting twist around this. And I know that we know that kind of chefs are almost always men, professional chefs, you know, women find it hard to make their way into that world. So I'm really intrigued by this division, this gender division of cooking environments, but I'll stop blethering. There is a hand up. I'm afraid I can't, Zoom's not telling me your name, but your AP somebody.
Hello, Andrew Pott.
Thanks, Andrew.
Hi. I said it in the chat. Everything that was talked about in every paper was really so redolent of my own family experience and environment and my memories. I can think of, with minor differences, equivalents of every experience really, and maybe, I mean, Paul commented too, but maybe I was an exception. But growing up in the 60s and 70s, I was in the kitchen with my mum and then my granny when she came to live with us, and the cupboards were full of Good House and cookbooks that were twice their original size because of the pasted in recipes. So undoubtedly, you know, I'm one example, and these spaces were certainly gendered. My dad didn't cook at all. He didn't even have the one classic signature dish, the one thing he could make. And I don't believe he even ever made breakfast either. But it was something my mum did to bring me into that space, and I remain a devoted cook, as it were, devoted family cook.
Thanks, Andrew. Katie.
Yeah, I was like, because it occurred to me about the World War II thing as well, that a lot of men, and World War I, of course, like a lot of men were taught to cook when they were in the military service, and obviously men are chefs, and so there are various kind of male experiences being in the Navy, those kind of things, where they are in charge of cooking and food, and so it made me wonder whether it's actually about the material culture of recipe books and how they get transmitted over time, and that sense that cooking is a woman's business, and so when you have a recipe book, you think about handing it on to a daughter and not onto a son, and it doesn't necessarily reflect what actually went on in the kitchen, which might have been a lot messier and complicated, but actually about, well, you know, who do certain types of inheritances get to be transmitted to, and so we have that strong sense that women give recipe books to women. So maybe the question is, where are men and their recipe books? Like, why are they not writing them down, or who's writing them down for them if it isn't them? Because my dad was a great cook, and he was raised in Central Africa, so he had lots of really interesting recipes and ingredients that we'd never heard of, and he could he could slaughter an animal and butcher it, so he was, you know, he's very dexterous, but he never had any of that written down. He just made us stand there and watch while he did it. So there is interesting questions around that too, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, something else that also struck me when we're thinking about the kind of emotional environments, and I think, Kate, you talked about this particularly in your focus upon kitchens as a site of kindness. And I totally agree with you. The kitchen is my happy place, but I'm also conscious that kitchens are profoundly stressful and angry environments as well. You know, not everyone loves cooking, and even those who love cooking, those of us who do sometimes hate it, right? Because it's a chore at the end of a long day, etc. And I wondered if other kinds of emotions came out of the kind of artifacts or engagements with family that you had in your kind of research, any of you?
I think in my case, I think in my case, I didn't say very much about my own history, but I was always conscious that the reason I don't like cooking very much and don't do very much cooking is that my mother, who was the youngest of 3 daughters, was made along with her sisters to do all the cooking, all of the housework, and to do all of the shopping. And my grandmother used to make her take things back, and she told horrible stories about endlessly taking food back to shops. And my mother swore that if she ever had a daughter, she wouldn't teach her how to cook at all. So when I got to university, that first night in Leeds, as it happened, I thought, well, I can probably heat beans, but that was as far as it went. So I have quite negative memories in a way of cooking.
Thanks, Val. Any of our other speakers, any more kind of other sorts of emotions?
I suppose the problem is I suppose when you're the viewer, and I know that I romanticize my granny because she was one of my favorite human beings. And so I kind of like have this really strong attachment to, but I also know that actually her, you know, did she actually choose this function? Like, because her daily life was built about with these 5 points of food production. And they changed when my grandfather retired because her lunchtime actually had to become a sort of cooked meal rather than the sandwich that she used to have. And I only know that because my mum told me about it. So I wonder if like she had been able to give voice more, because it's like the only way that I can tell these stories is through these objects. But I'm also completely sort of have such a rose-tinted glasses that she must have loved doing this. but it must have been a site of huge frustration, particularly because like for one of the things that her household ran very much like you know, dinner was on the table at 12 o'clock. And if it wasn't there by 1 minute past, my granddad and my dad and my brother would eventually move in and out of the kitchen. Like, where is dinner? Like so I wonder whether or not we actually can give voice to those emotions, because the projection they always conveyed was maybe not always what was going on underneath the surface.
Absolutely. I'm conscious that when I'm cooking a really elaborate meal, I'm doing it for myself, not always for others, even though it might look like, you know, I'm doing it in the service of others and I'm cooking with kindness. I am, but I'm also doing it because I love doing it. Anybody else on that? The kind of negative emotions of kitchens? Joanne.
Yes, I mean, I think it's a really important emotion or emotions cluster to think about, because of course, you know, what really struck me about the papers was how embodied and sensorial these memories are. So they were, I think, as Kate started by saying, you know, they're about time travel, but it is about putting you in that place. But then, of course, for many of us, as you say, or for some of us, those can be far different kinds of memories. So I only really knew my sort of maternal grandmother quite well, because she was the British one. My Italian one I didn't get to meet very often. So I have a whole legacy of absolutely hating cooking, fury around it. In lockdown, I had to do more baking and so on because we couldn't get access to stuff, and it enraged me. But then I remembered my mother being constantly enraged by cooking. But my grandmother. But what I realized is that they were both working women. So my grandmother was quite unusual. She was in Sunderland, and she took over she took over my granddad's shop because she said he was a bit useless and she had to make something of it. But then she just resented every moment that she had to cook. So my whole memory is of everything just being put in a pressure cooker, because those and just being cooked until they were basically pulp. And so, I have nothing about Sunday roasts, for example, an entirely different world, because eventually they had a hatch in the wall, and my nana wouldn't even come and sit down and eat with everybody else. She would just hand the food through the hatch and stay in permanent misery in the kitchen because she had to do this cooking. So it's really interesting that, you can have, Lucy kind of, the mythology there is of this wonderful place of kindness and comfort. And I've got this mythology of kind of, just a line of fury all the way through, where food is, actually, I do wonder if this links into, other aspects. I have all sorts of issues with food, actually. I don't really like food. I don't, and I do wonder if this is kind of part of my heritage. So I'm just really, I'm really interested in the negative emotions that food and its artifacts can generate.
Thanks, Joanne. We learn so much about each other in these moments, don't we? Any other questions on any other sorts of topics? Katie, is that a finger?
Yeah.
Sorry, beg your pardon. Yeah, sorry, go, Katie.
I was just going to add to Joanne's comment, really, is also like the recipe books celebrate food in some very real ways, and whereas it's true, like lots of people hate cooking, and even when they can cook very well, doesn't actually tell you a lot about what they actually feel while they're doing it. And especially I think on that daily basis, that we might get pleasure out of that big meal that you make when you have the whole Saturday to do it and nothing else to worry about. But the coming home every night after work and trying to figure out what on earth you're going to put on the table was never the most joyous of moments. And so I guess there's also that daily lived experience is not the same thing as a recipe book, and what a recipe book symbolizes and what it suggests. And so there's also an interesting thing there about, where is the recipe book for the people who hate cooking, Yeah,
absolutely. And what also fascinates me, for all of the speakers talked about how it's the desserts, the puddings, the sweets, the treats that these women are focused upon, so they're looking for their own little bit of something, that isn't about the everyday, the putting your meat into veg on the table. It's about a fantasy of something else going on there, which I think is really, really interesting. Carmen, did you have a finger up there before?
Sort of. I was thinking about the power structures that go into these things. So I had an immigrant great-grandmother who spent all her time in the kitchen, and we all very much remember that. And it's very positive, very cozy. The smells were good. The community was good. You always knew you could get a cup of tea and a piece of toast and whatever was on the stove. But it was also about power, because Grampy got a hair once in his food and would not speak to Gram for another week. And it's family lore that this error, this lack of attentiveness to this one detail that somehow happened in a tiny kitchen with 8 children, and he would no longer eat. He used that as a way to assert his dominance in the house and remind her of her duties. The other thing that I remember from Grampy is his horrible foods. In America in the 70s, for a man to have pig's trotters in a big jar on the countertop was really quite horrific, and all the grandchildren would come and stare and look very hard, and it was very much a reminder of where he was from, where we were from, and from this other culture. The little fish that now somebody has told me are probably eels that he would have, and the rest we would just stare and just horror, because it was of such foreign, but these were things that he brought into her kitchen and asserted that they must be there. But it was very much still her kitchen. But then he could also protest and do this dominance thing if it wasn't done to his specifications. But I also was thinking about the thing of men not cooking, it not being a gender thing. My granddad was a naval officer. He was widowed fairly early. He cooked. I remember him in the kitchen all the time. But I don't remember anything being written down. There's nothing that I would take back from Grandpa. I think of sourdough as being something from Grandpa because I know he used it, but there's nothing written down. And my own husband has taken over most of our cooking and he writes nothing down. I have to say, will you document this for me? Because I can't do this the way you do, which is a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And I would like to know how to do this thing. So there's a very different attitude and this kind of ad hoc thing. And it's also about power on some level. Keep information for self. Yeah, so
Thanks so much, Carmen. Thank you. Helen.
Yeah, just a personal one on that point about family politics and power. My mother always maintained she was the Scheherazade of the pudding, and she had to produce a pudding every night. And that was one of the things that actually got my brother and I cooking, because she would just say, just make me a pudding, make me a pudding. And of course we learnt those skills of Murder on the Mountain, but that kind of pressure was very much there because there was a definitive standard of what dinner was. So double-edged, really. Sometimes you enjoy it and sometimes you don't.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, have I missed any questions in the chat? I'm forever doing that when I'm teaching. Or has anybody got any more questions to ask our wonderful speakers?
There's a question.
I was wondering. Sorry, thank you, Katie.
I was just going to say there was a question in the chat about home remedies and cleaning products, which was kind of interesting.
Absolutely. Who asked that? Are they still with us?
Annabelle
there was in the recipe books of my grandmother, she had some cleaning recipes in there, yes, for furniture and blanket washing and moth proofing, how to moth proof a blanket. So yeah, very interesting. Home medicines, all sorts of things. So yeah, not just recipes in there, so sort of other household advice and tips, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what's was really struck in Alison's paper as well is that when you talked, Alison, about how these were spaces for writing about themselves in a way that they didn't have elsewhere. I think that was a really important point to make. Joanne.
Actually, Tanya, you just touched on it yourself there. I was going to ask the speakers and also then related to Lucy's observation that she wonders if she's projecting some of her understanding of the role of the cookbooks in her granny's life, because of her relationship with her. But anyway, I just wondered if the speakers felt that these cookbooks and their annotations and their interleaving and so on could be seen as the women who owned them constructing identities through those practices, because we do tend, if you had a commonplace book from the early modern period and it was a man's commonplace book as much as a woman's, you'd start to talk about the way in which they were constructing their identity through that, and you would read it for those insights and their place in their own culture. And I just wondered if you got that impression through the either your own family inherited cookbooks or those that, as with Val, the cookbooks that were shared with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really did strike me when I was looking at Great Aunt Amy's book that this was her as a young woman recording who she was. I haven't inherited anything similar from any other women in the family. But I think there is maybe something to do with the books that we collect. I'm kind of trying to think about this in relation to myself, for example, that if you look at the bookshelf behind me, you'll see this is where I keep my cookery books. And if you know anything about me, you'll kind of know how they tell the story of my adult life, and it goes back to when I discovered Elizabeth David and got terribly enthusiastic about cooking French and Italian recipes back in the early 70s when this was still quite exotic. And then I went through a very kind of whole earth, save the planet phase a year or two later, and I've got, you know, a first edition of Diet for a Small Planet, and which is something that came up on Twitter a few weeks ago because it was having an anniversary. So I suppose to that extent, my books do help to tell the story of my life, and it's an evolving life. And I don't necessarily cook now what I used to cook in the 1970s, although sometimes I do. But yeah, I don't know whether that's remotely helpful.
I think I definitely like these cookbooks, and it has to. I'm always a bit like, oh, I wish I did more with them in teaching. In some ways, like it would be lovely to share them with students. But even as someone who teaches in the 19th century, it's not necessarily a source, because I talk about Mrs. Beeton and other kind of conduct books, but I wouldn't necessarily like talk about cookery books. And I think they're really interesting because, you know, like we all know that like feminists generally tend to see housewifery as a burden and a drudgery that women don't in the post-war periods. But for my grandmother, she was definitely a conservative woman, and she was like a housewife. And there are ways in which she manipulated that and expanded on the idea of the housewife in some ways, because she inherited the house that I showed you on the slides, and she ended up she would make money by renting it out as a holiday home and a summer let. So she was in some ways a businesswoman as well, but her central role and something that she cultivated was around the home. And the cookery books are one of the only books that she actually kind of keeps, because if she was reading novels, it was always books that she took out from the library. So in terms of kind of the books that inherited, they are the only books that are kind of like personal to her. And I think the fact that she kept them is interesting, but she was also a massive hoarder. And I know that because when I grew up, we had to try and convince her to get rid of like 50 years worth of Women's Own, which now as a historian, I'm just like, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. But she, in the attic, there was just so much stuff. So I think it says something quite complicated about what actually housewifery was, because her books were so messy, but her house was so kind of ordered in many respects, and particularly the shared spaces.
I think that it's perhaps not so much about ways of the individual authors building and developing their identity and recording their identity. I think there's a lot of their children, daughters mostly, in my experience, projecting an identity through the books that they inherit, and interpreting, remembering as children what it was like to be living at home, and projecting onto their mothers a sense of homeliness and security and comfort and all those things that you expect of your mother, and they seem to do that through the cookery books, and I'm sure in most cases it's justified, but it may not be in all cases. I don't know.
Kate, did you have an answer for Joanne?
I don't really think, I mean, my grandma didn't have any other cookery books, to be honest. She didn't really collect them. She just collected them on scraps of paper from, you know, people she knew, or wrote them down when she came across them. And in terms of her identity, I mean, for me, I guess because of the role that she had right from being a young girl, food really was her. So, you know, for me, that was a big part of her identity. And it's not something we ever really thought about, but she was always in the kitchen. She was always cooking. She was always baking. I can't really remember any times where there were particular disasters or, you know, any negativity. I'm sure there must have been, because my grandfather was a very difficult man. So I'm sure living with him, you know, was not at all easy, but maybe I've blocked them out if there were any. You know, I sort of I take on board what Lucy said, you know, to a certain extent, because Grandma was such an important person to me, and Auntie, for similar reasons. I think it is very easy to have rose tinted glasses and see the good side. So we should always be aware that it's not always like that. But yeah, in terms of her identity, yeah, that was her, you know. So.
I suppose the question, yeah, how me teacher, and do these women keep any other ephemera? I mean, so they keep the cookbooks, so that says that they have some importance, but is there any other bits of paper, any other written form that they're keeping in the same way? As a balance, it tells you something about importance and identity. The things we choose to keep or don't have tell us as much as what we do have.
Yeah, it's really, sorry, you go, Kate.
I was just going to say, yes, absolutely. I mean, there are lots of things. I guess part of the rose tinted spectacle view of myself is that I didn't really want to throw anything out that was my grandma's. That, you know, there were lots of things that were triggers that I thought, no, I remember that in the home, or you know, I saw her using that, or I saw her wearing that piece of jewelry. So for me, I was very reluctant to let anything go. And in fact, one of the items that she did specify in her will for me was her piano, which isn't the easiest thing to house sometimes, as it's a baby grand one. But I won't part with it. You know, I'd rather not have a bed in a bedroom than part with a piano. So yes, there are lots of other items that we have dotted around the home that, yeah, remind me of her, remind me of Auntie and other ancestors as well. You know, so.
I think it's quite interesting. My granny was definitely the family custodian of our family archive. And but what she was really good at was making sure that everyone survived, but not her. And it was actually, I think, the cookery books that survived because they were an object that she used kind of all the time. And by the time she got ill, she just didn't have the capacity to throw them out. And we were clearing out her house as well. But it's really interesting that in terms of objects, we seem to have taken a lot of her objects because that's what she seems to have left. But when she died, the only thing that she specified in terms of objects was that the paper archive of her father had to go to the local museum and archive. And I thought that was really interesting that she always placed herself in the minimal role of someone having an important story to tell. Which, yeah, I think reinforces some of the stuff that Joanne and Tanya were talking about gender, in terms of what actually can we keep of women who don't think they're important.
Wonderful. What a great way to end. I think we have reached the end of our session, and there's no better way to conclude, Lucy. So thank you very much for that conclusion. And thank you, Carmen, for the question. It was ideal. Thank you to all of our wonderful speakers. Please join me in thanking them for their wonderful contributions. Lots of things to think about. And I look forward to discussing more. Joanne, do you have a way that you wrap these things up?
I just remind everybody when the next session is, which is Thursday, the 4th of November, at the same time for us all, and that will be about familial emotions across time, Bibles, religious books and quilts. So I hope you can join us again then. Thank you, everyone. I will close the meeting. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.